Tonight we left off last time sort of in the middle of a chapter. Um, Sort of in the middle, well, not really the middle, a little ways into chapter 17 of the book of Numbers. So we're going to be picking up when we get started again in Numbers 17, verse 6, uh, as we continue through the life of Moses. Um, we've skipped around a little bit because, of course, we're just covering the life of Moses, not verse by verse per se. I do that elsewhere. Uh, so I think everyone knows where to look if you want that. But right now we're sort of in the middle of a narrative piece. There are a few pieces of story, a few pieces of narrative in the book of Numbers, and we're in the middle of one of them. What we talked about last time and sort of the beginning of this section up to the point where we stopped last time is about the rebellion of Kora, or Kora's rebellion. Even though it was not just Kora, it was Kora and a couple of others, though the couple of others sort of backed down when challenged, and Kora sort of pressed his case all the way to the bitter end. Um, but not just these individual men, but these men as representatives of their clans and Korah was within the tribe of the Levites. The other men who were with him at first were heads of clans of other tribes. But essentially, they came and made the case uh, in front of Moses and in front of the people of the camp. So Israel is now encamped, making their journey, which, as we read a few studies ago, a few months ago, is going to end up taking them 40 years of traveling around. This is sort of a deliberate, it's not that they're lost, this is a deliberate waiting period because of the uh, sinfulness and the rebellion of the people, uh, in particular, this generation of people. God has said that this generation will not be the one that gets to enter into the land of Canaan. It will be their children once their children have grown to adulthood. And for that to happen, they're going to spend 40 years encamped in various parts of mostly the Sinai Peninsula. And then after that, God will lead them into the land and give it to their children, with the exceptions of Joshua and Caleb, who were faithful. And so that, of course, as one might imagine, um, now that that reality has settled in, uh, that has not caused the people of that generation who have now been told by God through Moses that they're going to die in the wilderness without seeing the promised land, hasn't done a lot to get them to stop with the grumbling and stop with the rebellion and sort of settle in and be more faithful. If anything, for people like Korah, it's done the opposite. And the particular area that Korah had problems with, um, presumably the other men with him at first had a wider scope, that the Levites had been chosen as a tribe to receive the priesthood. Korah is also a Levite, so for him, and the case he really pressed was that Aaron in particular, and Aaron's family in particular, and of course Moses is a family member of Aaron's, they had been given this leadership role over against all of the other Israelites and all of the other members, even of the tribe of Levi. Aaron was given to be high priest, and his sons to be sort of the presiding priests under him. Excuse me. And this is an office that was going to be inherited, meaning it wasn't like they were going to have an election in 4 years to elect a new high priest and Korah could put his name in. Uh, this was an office, this was a calling that was never going to be his. And he not only, as we said, challenged Moses and Aaron about this, but he went among and in front of the people of the camp to drum up support for himself, inciting them against Moses and Aaron's leadership, outright stating that this business of God having chosen them was nonsense, that they had just appointed themselves, that they were just lording it over the people. And as Kora presented it, are not all the people of Israel holy, right? Who are you to claim to be priests and preside over us? And we talked about how this is going back a ways. This is going back much earlier in the life of Moses. But remember, before the golden calf, right? Before the episode with the golden calf, the priesthood had not been restricted to the Levites. So what had happened in Israelite history until relatively recently, until a couple of years before this, was that the heads of clans, the heads of families, the heads of big extended families, had been the ones who offered sacrifices on behalf of their families. The sort of patriarch of the clan or family, part of his authority was a kind of priesthood. So when you go back into Genesis, as we read with Abraham, but also with Isaac, with Jacob, with Jacob's sons, they went and made sacrifices. They made the offerings for their family members, for their big extended clan and family. Job, same thing, goes and offers sacrifices himself for his children, for his wife, for his household. So this was the norm that they had been used to. And it's 2 years ago, and specifically related to the golden calf, that this was sort of taken away from them and given to this particular priesthood. And so that is a factor that we have to remember. We want to be fair even to the bad guys, right? And we talked a little bit last time toward the end about how this is still something that maybe we can identify with, that there are particular roles in the church to this day that are given to particular people in particular situations. And if that role is one that we kind of would like to have, and if we're not one of the people to whom it's been given, that can rub us the wrong way. That can chafe a lot for us, right? And so that's what's going on with Kora, right? That's what's going on with him. And it's not just that he's denied it, it's that he feels it was taken away from him. But even if we might sort of understand his motivations and how that would hurt or upset someone, what he's chosen to do with that, what he chose to do with that was to incite discord, further rebellion against Moses, against Aaron, ultimately against God's authority over the people, and to disrupt the life of the whole community. Right. And so regardless of what we think of what might be motivating him or the reasons behind what he's doing is a legitimate problem, and a problem that jeopardizes the lives and the salvation of all of the people in the camp, right? He's disrupting sort of all of God's people and trying to turn them against the authorities that God has put over them, and thereby against God himself. And so that can't just be ignored. We can't just say, well, just ignore Kora. We know where he's coming from. This has to be dealt with. And so as we read last time, Kora and the others were given one last chance to sort of go back to their tents and drop this and let go of it. Everyone but Kora did. And then Kora and his household who had joined him in this rebellion were swallowed up by the earth. And so at the very end, last time we read the first little part of chapter 17. And so part of what had happened in this before the ground opened up was that they had taken censers, like incense censers, and Kora and his people on his side had taken them, and Aaron and his sons, right, on their side had taken them. And the idea was, well, we'll see whose incense offering God accepts. And so after Kora and his sons are swallowed up by the earth, their censers were taken and made into this sort of covering for the altar of incense in the tabernacle that would serve as sort of a reminder and would serve to point future generations to the fact that it was Aaron and his line who God had chosen to be the high priest and to offer incense before the Lord, and that no one else should do it. No one else should do it. And we talked last time about how the fact that someone isn't called to some particular thing, some particular role, some particular office within the church, among God's people, in the world, in the community, doesn't mean that there's sort of nothing for them, right? There are other callings, there are other gifts that God gives. And when we finished up last time, we talked about how even the sons of Korah, the ones who survived, the members of Korah's family, his descendants, the members of that clan who survived, ended up writing a chunk of the book of Psalms. So they, as Levites, became hymnographers, essentially, which is itself a perfectly noble and beautiful calling, just a different one than the high priesthood. So that's sort of where we left off. So where we left off was right with the issue of the censors. But as we're going to see when we pick up tonight here in sort of mid-chapter, in chapter 17 of Numbers, is that what started with Korah, Korah started this sort of unsettled things and started rebellion and murmuring and muttering and these things, and incited this ill feeling towards Moses and Aaron, and that even seeing the ground swallow up Kora and his family doesn't just sort of instantly end the issue, doesn't sort of instantly solve the problems. Everybody's like, oh, well, okay, we get it. Everybody goes back to their house, and now we're all peaceful and we all get along. And we're all going to live faithfully to God from here on out. That's not what happens. So things are going to get a little worse before they get better. Spoilers. Before we start though, we'll pray really quickly and then we'll get into it. O Heavenly King, the comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. Okay, so Numbers 17, verse 6. The next day, the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron, saying, you killed the people of the Lord. Okay. So, as we said, right, this doesn't put an end to everything. In fact, for a lot of the people who were on the side of where Korah and those with him were coming from, the fact that they're dead, they're reading this as, oh, now Moses and Aaron have killed a bunch of people who opposed them. That's who they are. Now, as modern people, right, we would be thinking like the ground opened up and swallowed them. Right, like pretty clearly Moses and Aaron can't just do that, right? Like make that happen. That would have to be God. And so see, when we read it, we say, oh, well, see, clearly this is God saying Korah's in the wrong, right? Aaron and Moses are the people he's chosen, right? That's how, it clicks very easily for us. But we have to remember who these folks are. And your average Israelite, as we've talked about, and as we've seen with these problems on and on again, are fairly typical ancient Near Eastern people. And so they understand the world in a different way than we do, right? Like the golden calf just seems bizarre to us. Moses is gone for 40 days. So you make a gold calf and start worshiping it and having like this big sexual orgy and feast around it. Like that's not something we would do after a month. You know, your church goes a month without a priest. I'm sure that's last on the list of things that would be suggested for the next Sunday. But these are different people living at a different time. So in their understanding, there are concepts like magic. There are concepts, their concept of the way gods relate to human prophets and human priests, and practitioners, sorcerers, magicians, is very different than our understanding of the true God and his prophets. We get our understanding of that beginning here in the Torah with the relationship between God and Moses, but they're living at that time, right? They don't have scriptures yet. They don't have things to consult. God is reorienting them from sort of a pagan way of looking at the world to the correct way of looking at the world. That's in process right now, and it's at the beginning of the process right now, as we're reading in the book of Numbers. And so, that being the case, when they see, oh, these people opposed Moses and Aaron got mad at them, the ground opened up and swallowed them. They look at it as, well, Moses and Aaron, yes, they serve some kind of God and they have some kind of magic or powers. They're able to work wonders. They're able to do these things because, they've got that rod, right? Like the plagues on Egypt and stuff. So to them, it's natural for them to assume, oh no, this is just Moses and Aaron using their power, their sort of divine power, to dispose of opponents, right? And so these folks aren't going to stand up and give their name and oppose Moses and Aaron the way Kora did, because if nothing else, they just saw what happened when Kora did that, right? So that's not what they're going to do. But they are going to sort of murmur amongst themselves. They are going to spread rumors. They are going to say, oh, see, these are tyrants who have, lording it over us, right? Kora was right. And look, they killed him for coming and telling the truth, right? So this is the kind of thing that's now happening. There's this broad sort of scuttlebutt, right? Kind of disinformation campaign going on against Moses and Aaron, right? And that is just as, or potentially even more dangerous than just Kora standing up and openly opposing Moses. Because Kora standing up and openly opposing Moses, you can deal with that openly, right? When the opposition, when the rebellion is sort of this groundswell and it's happening through rumors and mutterings and people collaborating together and what have you, that's much more difficult to kind of answer and deal with and get to everyone. And we're going to see there's going to be consequences because this is going to have to be dealt with. Now it happened when the congregation regrouped itself against Moses and Aaron. They hastened to the tabernacle of testimony, and the cloud covered it, and the Lord's glory was seen. Okay. So they all kind of gather together and head down to the tabernacle, right? Head down to the gateway to the tabernacle. The way it's written, intending to have some kind of confrontation with Moses and Aaron about what happened the day before. We don't know how that would have unfolded, things being different. But when they get there, the presence of the Lord, the presence of Yahweh, the presence of God, right? The cloud, the glowing cloud, is over the tabernacle already when they arrive. Then Moses and Aaron entered the front of the tabernacle of testimony, and the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Get away from the midst of this congregation, and I will utterly destroy them at once." So they fell on their faces. Okay. So they go in to meet with God, because God has descended upon the tent. Moses and Aaron go in to speak with him, and God says, "Get away from the congregation," I mean, the whole assembly, the whole group, the whole camp, the whole group of people of the camp, right? Get away from them, because I'm going to deal with them. And while you may not remember from last month, this is the same language that was used regarding Kora. When they gave that last warning, they said, "Everybody who's not with Kora, get away from Kora." Right? And then the ground opened up and swallowed him. So that seems to be where this is going. Okay. That seems to be where this is going, but with the whole people. And so when it says Moses and Aaron fell down on their faces, this is preparing us. We may have noticed this pattern as we've been going through here. Israel rebels against God. God, at least in what he says to Moses, is ready to end it. Usually what God says is, I'm just going to do away with these people, and we'll start over with your descendants, Moses, right? The way I started the first time with Abraham's descendants, we'll just start with your descendants, and go from there. And then when God says that to Moses, Moses then intercedes for the very people who are coming against him, the very people who are most of the time talking about killing him, right? Who are opposed to him. Moses ends up interceding for God to spare them, right? Again and again and again. And so if we follow this pattern, and we see Moses and Aaron fall on their faces before God after he says this, we understand that they're preparing once again to try to intercede, right? To try to intercede on the people's behalf, that God would be merciful to them yet again in yet another rebellion. Despite the fact that the rebellion is against Moses and Aaron as much as it is against God. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Take the censer, put fire in it from the altar, throw incense on it, and carry it quickly to the camp, and make atonement for them. For wrath has come out from the Lord's face and is beginning to strike the people." Okay. So Moses says, "Go and get your censer." Remember the censer from yesterday, right? Go and get it. And he says to use it to make atonement for the people. Now this is, I know, the Wayback Machine for everybody now. When we were back in the book of Leviticus and the Day of Atonement. But as we talked about there, atonement really is about purification. And so without belaboring all that all over again, what Moses is saying here is for Aaron to take the censer and use the censer for purification, meaning the smoke that the incense produces. So we talked about, in terms of the Day of Atonement, that the animal that is sacrificed to God, the goat that's sacrificed to God, its blood, sort of the byproduct of that sacrifice, the blood has to be drained from the sacrifice. That blood is then holy, and you can use it to purify and cleanse things from the stain of sin. Incense works the same way, right? The offering of incense, the incense is burned, the incense is offered to God as a sacrificial offering. The smoke rises up, but that smoke that is produced from the offering is also used then to cleanse and to purify things, right? And so not only is this what Aaron is to do, right? Purify them from their sin and their wickedness so that they aren't destroyed, right? Because the kind of destruction that's coming on them is the kind of destruction that came on Nadab and Abihu, right? They are sinful and wicked people who are now in the presence of a holy God. And God's holiness is going to destroy them unless they're purified. So this is what Aaron is going to do with the censer, but this is an especially appropriate way of doing it because remember what the test was the day before. The test the day before for who it was who is to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people was whose incense from whose censer will God accept, right? So this is twofold. Number one, this represents a way on behalf of Moses for Aaron to intercede for the people before God and for them to receive mercy from God for their sinfulness, but also the fact that it is through Aaron's offering of incense that they receive this mercy should be a sign to them of the legitimacy of Aaron's authority, number one, right? Number one, the legitimacy that sparked the original rebellion. Is he legitimately the high priest? But then also number two, the character of his high priesthood, because remember, today, right, that was yesterday. Today, Moses and Aaron are being accused basically of having murdered Kora as their rival, right? So they're accused not only of not legitimately having the authority, but of using that authority in this kind of vindictive, draconic way against the people. And so this will show both the legitimacy of Aaron's authority and that Aaron is using his authority to seek mercy for the people, to offer atonement, forgiveness to the people for their sins. So not only is it legitimate, but he is exercising it in a correct way and in a godly way and in the opposite way from what he's been accused. So Aaron took it as Moses told him and ran into the assembly, and already the plague had begun among the people. So he threw in the incense and made atonement for the people, and he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague ceased. Okay. So the particular form that what we would call God's wrath, right, which is really the holiness of God amongst an unholy people, the form it takes is a plague, right? Now, the word for plague here is just sort of the generic word for plague. So this could mean literally a disease, right? But remember also we had in Egypt the 10 plagues, and they were not 10 different diseases, right? So plague can be disease. It could also be other related things that are bringing about the weakness, the death, right, of these people. But it is as a result of their unholiness in the presence of God's holiness. And where Aaron brings the smoke, the plague, it's like it's a barrier. It's like the smoke from his censer is a barrier that the plague doesn't pass through. And so he is able to protect the people, right? And this is a very powerful image, right, within the whole system outlined by the Torah of what it's doing and how it works, right? Remember, the whole idea is that we have these concentric circles of holiness. The Holy of Holies, the tabernacle where God dwells, then the holy place, then the tabernacle courts, then the camp, then the world. And the closer you are into God, the higher level of holiness you have to maintain for that to be able to happen and to be able to happen safely. Right. And so this whole system is about managing the people's sin, right? In order to make that possible, in order to prevent any harm coming upon them from God's holiness, and able to allow them to approach God, to worship God, for God to dwell with them and share his life with them. All of that is made possible by the sacrificial system and what the priesthood does. And so Aaron is here very powerfully and very publicly exercising that role as high priest, right, in showing how he, through his office and through the offerings he makes, allows that to happen safely. Whereas without that office, without his execution of that office, and his sons and sons and on, then we are in this danger situation where either the people are going to be wiped out or God is going to have to leave. And we know that, of course, ultimately in Israel's history, after Israel has split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, that the northern kingdom of Israel is going to be destroyed, and the southern kingdom of Judah, God is going to leave the temple, and then they're going to end up going into exile. So this sort of maintenance system here, Aaron is doing it in public. Normally he's offering the incense in the tabernacle off by himself. He's doing the Day of Atonement ritual back in the Holy of Holies. He's the only one allowed to go in there. But now he's exercising that ministry very publicly. And as we said, showing both that he's the one to do it and the nature of that ministry that he is performing. Now, those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died because of Kora. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the door of the tabernacle of testimony, and the plague ceased. So this display happens through Aaron, and then the plague ceases. A number of people are dead. A large number of people are dead, right? Keep in mind, these are people who had already received the verdict that they were going to live out their lives and die in the desert. But God sort of allows this to happen so that he can again make this public statement to try to show the Israelites sort of the error of their whole way of viewing the world, their whole way of thinking, their whole way of operating. And as we said, we know what happens in the future history of Israel. We know that they still don't get the message. It's important also, though, to remember that this is not like they're not getting the message of God has decided, hey, I want you to live this one way, and you're too stubborn to do what I want you to do, and so I'm angry, and so I'm going to occasionally make a big public display of killing a bunch of you in order to make the rest of you fall in line and do what I tell you to, right?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So what would be like then the correct in terms of, Orthodox way of thinking, the response to like people who say, well, oh, if your God is so good and omniscient, why couldn't he have like figured out a different way to reorient them?
Right. Well, so I mean, the other way, I guess, would be to reorient them by force. That's meaning not allow them to choose what to do, right? Because right, the place I was headed was the commandments God has given Israel aren't like arbitrary. It's not just some rules God made up that are like otherwise irrelevant. You can't have a society that's based on like murder, right? You can't have a society that's participating in acts of cannibalism. You can't have a society that's predatory on its neighbor, right? This is the laws that God has given, the commandments God has given, don't just bring life in the sense that God makes an arbitrary rule, and if you keep it, he gives you life, whatever that would mean. or he lets you live, but they give life in the sense that living your life in a certain way produces more life, right? Is good, right? Produces goodness, produces harmony, produces peace, uh, produces safety, right? Allows you to live a long life, be fruitful, have children, have grandchildren, watch them grow up and grow old, right? These are all, this is the way of life that God is laying out for them, right? So the problem with us humans is, I mean, you could sum it up with we're stupid, but it's it's that for the most part, we don't really understand what's best for us. We're still like the little kid who eats a whole bag of Oreos because the Oreos taste good, you know, who will eat himself sick on raw sugar, right? Just because it tastes good. We do all kinds of things that we know are harmful in the long run because they're pleasurable in the short run. Even those of us who have come to some kind of enlightened understanding and can see what is good and what is evil and know what we ought to do, half the time don't do it, or we take shortcuts, right? Or we do other things for other reasons. And so God is struggling with them. He's gonna frame it ultimately at the end of Deuteronomy, at the end of the Torah. He's going to say to them, behold, I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses, right? If you live this one way, things will go well with you. You will have a good life in the world, right? You will have life in the world to come. Everything will be wonderful. If you live this other way, right, your life's going to become a nightmare. It's going to become horrible. It's going to become terrible. All of this is going to happen. And he says to them, choose. But he's struggling with them and he's pleading with them and he's working with them and revealing himself to them and on to try to get them to choose life. Right? To try to get them to choose life. And they don't. Right? Because we don't. Right? Because they're like us and we don't. And again, we choose something else. Right? And he pleads with them. And we say, okay, yeah, but there's a bunch of people dead. Well, you know, we can't be sort of childish about this, right? In the sense that it's, you know, well, if those people want to be evil and they want to destroy themselves, why doesn't God just let them go do that? Right? Well, okay, but they're living around a whole bunch of other people, right? And
Yeah, it's that
by
common, it's like that common trope of like, oh, why does it concern you what two consenting adults are doing in their private homes or whatever?
well, it depends on what they're doing,
Right.
right? If
Just
they're
that
abducting and
similar
murdering
vein of
children, I'm
thinking.
very concerned.
Right.
Right? Like, um, you know, the fact is humans live in community. This is a basic fact. Like there are basic facts about humans, and you don't have to be religious at all even to understand this. Okay, I could go to an atheist who believes, you know, whole hog in some form of evolutionary theory, and I could say, okay, humans are pack animals, right? They don't live solitarily, right? And by the way, humans as higher mammals mate for life, right? I mean, it's in our biology, it's in our nature, it's just built into humans, right? You can come at this without, not from the perspective of religion, and arrive at least partially at the same place. And St. Paul says that, right? St. Paul says, for example, in Romans 2, that there are a bunch of Gentiles out there who have never heard the word Torah, but some of them do a better job of keeping the Torah than some of the Jewish people do who read it every week. Right? Because they look at themselves and their lives and the world around them and they can figure out, right? Like, how they should live, at least in broad strokes, at least in very broad strokes. So there's that communal level. People live together in community, and they will lift each other up or they will drag each other down. And at a certain point, if there's segments of the community that are dragging the community down, they need to be excised from the community. Well, you say, okay, well, then why did these people die? Why didn't they just get forced to leave? Okay, they're now out in the Sinai desert. What happens to them? They starve to death. They get murdered by bandits. They get eaten by wild animals. Right? Like them dying pretty much instantly in this plague is actually more humane than exiling them out in the middle of the Sinai desert would be. Right? That's why later on, and we're not going to get into it here because we're focused on the life of Moses, but in the Torah, there are places that we usually describe them as being the death penalty. But what it actually says in the text is something like they will be cut off from among the people. Meaning, what exactly? Is that they have to be killed, or is that they have to be exiled, or is that, well, for ancient people, that was the same thing. That was 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And again, this isn't just this is ancient people, not just in the Bible, because you could look at Plato's Apology. They tell Socrates they're going to exile him from Athens. He says, I'd rather just commit suicide. Right? They'd be exiled from Athens because he says that would be death for me anyway. It would be a more horrible death. And we don't understand that because we're like, okay, they throw me out of Lafayette, I'll move to, Baton Rouge, right? Like, who cares? Right? But there was a much deeper understanding in the ancient world of the connection between people and the places where they live. There is just as deep a connection today. We just a lot of times don't like to acknowledge it, or we've moved it to a much larger level. Like pretty much anybody who lives in the US is willing to admit at some level that they're an American. Right? Even if they really hate the government, even if they, don't like a lot of things in American history, they can't deny at the heart of it that they've been shaped by the culture, right? Part of their identity and who they are has been deeply shaped by the culture, their families, their circle of friends, the people they know, the people they care about, are people surrounding them in America, right? That's it. So yeah, this is the only sort of other way for God to do this is to just not give humans freedom, not allow them to choose. Basically force them to love him, which obviates the whole purpose for which God created not just humans, but created anything. Right? God creates humans to share his life with them. It's not sharing his life if they're like robots, if they're compelled, they're just puppets, right? To whatever he does, right? That would be a different kind of purpose and a very different kind of God. If we were just sort of his action figures that he plays with, right? But no, God creates us free and gives us agency. And he, then does everything to try to get us to make the right choices and to live lives that are full of joy and love and peace. A lot of times we won't. And when it gets to the point where we refuse to do that and we want to live a different kind of life with violence and rebellion and wickedness, then if us doing that threatens those people who are trying to be faithful to God and to live those good lives, then ultimately God does something about it. Maybe not the same day. In this case, it's the same day. May not be the same day, may not be the same year, right? But ultimately, that's what the judgment seat of Christ is about, is that ultimately God is going to do something about it. That's not just allowed to pass. God doesn't just allow us to victimize other people and there be no consequences of that. Which is why a big part of the way of life God puts forward is repentance. And repentance is us doing something about that before God has to do something about that. That's why it says in the New Testament, we judge ourselves, we will not be judged. Right? If we take care of it, we judge ourselves and see our failings and move and correct them, then God doesn't have to correct those things. If we make amends and make peace with the people we've wronged, for example. Yeah. So that's what this is. It's very dramatic. It's very public. God's dealing with Bronze Age people in a different time, in a different place than us. But this is God showing them in 12, and he's going to show them in yet another way. He's going to try to solve this whole issue of Aaron once and for all in yet another way. And this one's going to be more nonviolent. Right. But remember also that you could say, oh, well, all these people died. Well, when that mob showed up at the beginning of our reading tonight to confront Moses and Aaron, they weren't coming there to just say, we'd like to register a polite complaint about the fact that we think it was kind of heavy-handed that Kora died. Right? That's not why they were there. Right? They were an angry mob. Right? And they've threatened to kill Moses before. So a lot of factors here. But now, as we get to this last part of the chapter, God is going to yet again try to resolve this sort of once and for all in a public way. Verse 16, after this, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and get a rod from them, a rod from each of their fathers' houses, from all their rulers according to their fathers' houses, 12 rods, write each man's name on his rod. Okay. So these rods are symbols of authority, as we've said before, right? It's not just like a walking stick, right? This is a symbol of authority, the symbol of judgment. The rod was used in a very literal way in the ancient world to discipline children across their backside. It was used when herding, to keep animals in line. So it is a symbol of authority and a symbol of discipline, right? And so God says, get one from each of the heads of the family, of the clans, right? So remember, the way things are structured, there's the 12 tribes. And then within the 12 tribes, there are clans, which are big related groups of extended families. And then there are individual extended families. And so these are the heads of all the clans within the tribes. Those are supposed to get a rod from each of them. Notice it's not just the Levites, it's all of them. Okay. This has to do with the question of the high priesthood, but Kora had a couple of people from other tribes. Okay. And each person who gives them a rod, that sort of patriarch of that clan, sort of carves his name into it. So we know whose is whose. And the rod sort of represents them and their authority. You shall also write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi, for there is one rod that shall be given according to the tribe of their fathers' houses. So the Levites, only give one rod, unlike the other tribes where it's every clan. And that rod is Aaron's rod and has Aaron's name carved into it. Then you shall put them in the tabernacle of testimony before the ark of the testimony, where I will be known to you. So it shall be, the man I choose, his rod will blossom. Thus I will remove the murmurings of the children of Israel, which they murmur against you. And so he says, you're going to take all these rods, you're going to take them into the Holy of Holies. You're going to take them in with the Ark of the Covenant. You're going to leave them there before the Ark of the Covenant. right? Sort of in God's presence, right? The place of God's presence. And the person who he chooses to be the high priest, that rod is going to blossom, right? Meaning little branches are going to grow and little buds and blossoms on the branches and flowers, right? And this is going to, they're going to open up, right? And you're going to come and you're going to find it, you're going to have something you could show to the people of Israel, this miraculous thing to prove that it's God who has put Aaron in that role. Then Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and each of their rulers gave him a rod apiece, for each ruler according to their fathers' houses, 12 rods, and Aaron's rod was in the middle of their rods. Moses then put the rods before the Lord at the tabernacle of testimony. Now it came to pass on the next day, Moses entered the tabernacle of testimony, and behold, Aaron's rod for the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, and had produced blossoms and yielded ripe almonds. Okay. So not only does this stick have new growth and blossoms and flowers and things, but ripe almonds have grown out of it. So this is not something you could artificially produce, right? Just it blossoming, just this piece of wood blossoming and everything would be miraculous. But this is, a season's growth has happened overnight on top of everything else. Then Moses brought out all the rods from before the Lord to all the children of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. The Lord then said to Moses, bring Aaron's rod back before the testimonies as a sign to the sons of the disobedient, and let their murmuring cease from before me, lest they die. Thus Moses did as the Lord ordered him, so he did. Okay. So after everybody sees this, Aaron's rod that's blossomed and budded and everything is brought back and is kept in the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. Notice, we talked about this before, but folks, for some reason, well, not for some reason, because of a mistranslation in a lot of the English translations of the book of Hebrews, and people are more familiar with that than they are with the Old Testament, sometimes think that there are multiple things inside the Ark of the Covenant. The only thing inside the Ark of the Covenant are the tablets that Moses received from God on Mount Sinai. There was a gold jar filled with manna that we read about that was placed in the Holy of Holies with the Ark. And now Aaron's rod, which has blossomed forth, is put, you can read it right there, in the Holy of Holies with the Ark, but they're not in the Ark. Those two things are not inside the Ark of the Covenant. They're with the Ark of the Covenant. So the children of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, behold, we are utterly destroyed, we are ruined, we are consumed. Whoever touches the tabernacle of the Lord dies. Shall we utterly die? So now this is the end of narrative. That's how this narrative portion ends. Right? This is how the narrative portion ends, and it's going to go to talking about, okay, well, here are the things that priests and Levites do, and some guides to things. We're going to end up skipping over that before we start next time and going to the next narrative portion. But we're to understand that last little bit, as sort of dire as it is as an ending, as now the Israelites get it. Right? That they get the fact of, number one, how holy God is, and number two, how sinfully they've been acting. And they realize how incompatible those two things are. Right? And so the segue to here are the duties of a priest is actually very appropriate, right? Based on what we've already been saying tonight. Right? That very disjunction, the thing that the people are now aware of, that's the reason for the priesthood. That's the reason for the priests here, the Levitical priests. That's their whole raison d'etre. That's what they're here to resolve. Okay. And this is why, as Hebrews is going to say, amongst other places in the New Testament, why the Levitical priesthood is no longer necessary after the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ, right? Because he has in his own flesh united God and man in such a way that he has purified humanity, and he's dealt with this problem sort of once and for all. But at this point, this problem persists, and the Levitical priesthood is there to manage it, right? And to deal with this problem. So before we shift to just Q&A for the rest of our time, a little more on Aaron's rod that budded, because Aaron's rod that budded, the budding of Aaron's rod, this comes up. You may off the top of your head be able to think of a bunch of hymns, right, that connect this to different things. So we have hymns about the cross that connect it to Aaron's rod that budded. We have hymns about the Theotokos that connect her to Aaron's rod that budded. We have generally things about the priesthood that in a more obvious, those are related in a more obvious way, right, to Aaron's rod budding and designating who will be the priest. But those other two comparisons in particular, I want to say something about. A lot of times the comparisons of the cross to Aaron's rod that budded get written off by people. They just kind of say, oh, well, yeah, you Christians, anytime you see a piece of wood in the Old Testament, you just go, oh, yeah, that's the cross, right? In fact, Nietzsche said exactly that at one point. He said, Christians, every time they see a stick of wood in the Old Testament, like, oh, look, the cross. But that's not really what's going on, right? That's not really what's going on. So the key of the miracle that we just read about is the fact that a rod, right, that you're going to be using for this purpose, as this symbol of authority, using it for correction and discipline, whatever, this is a dead piece of wood, right? It is dead. It can't grow, right? It can't bring forth anything. It is a dead piece of wood that, right, you can use for those purposes, for discipline, right, to exercise authority, what have you, but it's fundamentally dead, right? And so the miracle here is that a dead thing, right, a dead thing brings forth life. And not just life, but life that is beautiful and is nourishing, right? Because we've got the almonds, remember, too. And so the comparison to the cross, right? The cross, we don't, the back when the Mel Gibson movie Passion of the Christ came out, there were some Orthodox folks. This is way back in the long ago time. You youngsters, you may not remember. But there were some folks in the Orthodox Church who, these are Americans, right? Not people overseas, but who thought it went a little overboard with the blood and the gore. If you've seen the Mel Gibson movie Passion of the Christ, it's not for the faint of heart in terms of blood and gore, and the depiction, trying to depict the reality of Roman brutality and how horrific crucifixion was, in a realistic way. So it is very graphic. They're critical of it for being graphic, but the argument they made, right, there may be valid reason to say, hey, you don't need to be quite that graphic. But the argument they made was, well, the gospel accounts aren't very graphic. The gospel accounts just say, oh, Jesus was crucified. And while he was being crucified, X, Y, Z happened. They don't give all these gory details in the gospels, right? And so therefore you shouldn't. Well, the problem there is that the people who wrote the gospels and the people who first read the gospels had seen people crucified, right? So they knew how horrible it was. They had seen firsthand, live in person in front of them, because that's why the Romans crucified people. They did it publicly to make people watch, right? To make them afraid of the Romans, right? And make them fall in line as a public display. So they had seen this, right? So the gospel writers didn't have to go into gory details. They just had to mention that he was crucified, and that called to mind all of these horrifying images for the original people who read it. And so we're used to seeing crosses Even when we see like icons of the crucifixion, like all icons are beautiful, right? And we don't see, so we don't, have those same connotations. But a cross to ancient people was a symbol like a noose, right? Or a guillotine, or right? This is an instrument of execution, of public, painful, humiliating sort of execution associated with nothing but death, right? Nothing good is related to and can come out of that. So in associating the cross with Aaron's rod that budded, right? The hymnographers, the fathers who make this comparison, what they're doing is, and the idea of the budded cross, which you sometimes will see in Orthodox iconography. The idea is that this dead thing, this thing associated with death, there's been this miraculous inversion by the power of God, by the act of God, that has brought new life out of it. New life that is beautiful and is nourishing out of this sort of dead and ugly piece of wood. Right. So they're making a comparison on a sort of deeper level than just, oh, hey, the cross is made of wood, the rod's made of wood, right? There's a lot more, right, going on here. In terms of the Theotokos, the comparison that's being made is actually talking about her womb, right? Now, the womb of the Theotokos was not dead in the sense that, say, Sarah's was, right? Abraham's wife, Sarah. When we read the life of Abraham, Sarah's womb was dead because she was, 90 years old, right? So her womb was not going to be able to bring forth life, right? To have a child, but then miraculously she does. But the Theotokos, being a virgin, there was no seed involved, right? So there being no seed involved, you can't sort of grow a plant without seed. If you took Aaron's rod or another stick or a walking stick or a staff or just anything made of wood, you can go and shove it in the ground and you can water it, right? And the water will maybe rot it out, but it's not going to bud forth and grow anything, right? Other than maybe, mold or fungus. But I mean, like, it's not going to, you're going to have, I put out a new mailbox, it's not going to grow almonds, right? Next week. It's not going to grow beautiful flowers, right? And so the connection to the Theotokos is talking about her womb flowering with beautiful, nourishing life, namely Christ, despite not having any seed planted there, from which that life would normally proceed. So there are those two comparisons. This is the episode that those comparisons and those hymns are referring to, and sort of, at least at one level, the comparisons being made. So that said, as I said, we're at the end of a chapter and there's going to be a little break. We're going to skip a little bit before we pick up next time in the book of Numbers. So we've got some time if anybody has any questions or comments or pro tips for Marvel rivals, we can address those. And questions can pertain to what we talked about tonight or just more general issues. We got 15 minutes or so. We have a question in the chat, which means I got to put my cheaters back on. So the question is basically about an Orthodox Bible translation beyond what we have with the Orthodox Study Bible, which is sort of that, but sort of not that. So I don't know. I don't think it's impossible that that will happen in our lifetime. Some of you here today may live to see it. Um, but I know firsthand because of people calling me and asking me about being involved of at least 3 different projects, the different companies and different places and different people have tried to kind of get started in that respect, or are working on currently to try to get going, or they've made some kind of beginning, but it's kind of gotten stalled out at a certain point. So when I express my skepticism that it's going to be soon, it's based on that. It's not just that I know that it's a large undertaking, it's that uh, there have been many recent attempts in the last few years to try and engage that work, and so far none of them have progressed very far. We'll put it that way. None of them have made great progress. None of them have produced. None of them are on track to produce anything in the next 10 years that would be published and in your hands. There's a bunch of reasons why. I'll just be honest like usual. One of them is, frankly, we don't have a lot of Orthodox biblical scholars. We're past the point. Until a few years ago, I could count them all. And by biblical scholars, I mean people with PhDs in biblical studies. In biblical studies, right? Meaning involving the languages. So there are folks who do good work about the Bible, Orthodox scholars who are legitimate Orthodox Christians, some of them clergy, legitimate Orthodox scholars. They do stuff related to the Bible, but their PhDs, for example, they have a PhD in patristics, and they sort of specialize in patristic interpretation of the Bible, which is a totally legitimate field and an important field to work in. But when you go and get a PhD in patristics and you study patristic interpretation of the Bible, you don't learn the biblical languages. You don't learn Hebrew, you don't learn biblical Greek, you don't learn Aramaic. And so when it comes to translation work, like a person like that is great for writing study Bible notes, right? They can tell you, this here's, oh yeah, I know, 3 fathers who come in on this passage, and here's their, right? Great for study Bible notes, but in terms of actually doing a translation, that's not in their wheelhouse. They haven't studied the languages. So when I say biblical scholars, like with a biblical studies background, I mean they've studied the languages. Up until a few years ago, I could literally count on one hand those people in the US who would do an English project. Now I could do it on 2 hands, but I've had to go to the second hand. So that means it's moving in the right direction. So there's not a lot of people to do the work. In addition to having the people who are able to do the work, and not only do you have to have a sufficient number of people, you have to have a sufficient number of people who are willing to dedicate a sufficient amount of time to do that work. And that time is also, there's an opportunity cost, right? So if I'm brought in on the project and my piece of the translation is, say, going to take 300 hours of my time, spread out obviously over a long period, but 300 hours of my time, that's 300 hours of time that I'm not teaching a class, writing a book on something else, right? XYZ. So that has to be taken into account too. And each individual scholar is going to say, how much of my time can I give at what kind of rate, based on that cost, right? They might say, I'm working on a book on topic X, and topic X is really timely right now in the Orthodox world. I really feel like that's a bigger contribution than yet another Bible translation, right? So you've got to get enough people with enough time, and then you've got to find somebody with the real gifts to be able to organize all of that and to work with all of those people. You need a really competent manager. It's not just organizing as in like, okay, well, here's this guy's translation and here's this woman's translation, and okay, now we've got all the translations. But when you've got a Bible translation, you want it to all flow, right? You don't want it to sound like when you go from one book to another, like it was translated by a completely different person, because the English is completely different. So you've got to smooth it out, but you've got to smooth it out in a way that doesn't tick off any of those writers because of the changes you've made. And us scholars all have egos and all, have our own personal opinions that we think are very important. I'll speak in the first person about that, right? So I'm not accusing other people, it's me too, sure. And so managing all of that and preparing all of that and putting all of that together is a huge challenge. It takes a person, like I said, with a very particular set of managerial skills and things. And we've got to find all those people with all that time, all at once, all ready to go to work. And that hasn't happened yet. And that's why a real serious push that's going to produce something like that hasn't happened yet. So that may be a little bit of a black pill, or at least a charcoal or dark gray pill on the whole thing, but I'm being as honest as I can.
So
Yeah.
the corollary to that, there have been people and individual groups who've gotten together and done massive translations of hymnographies. Like, I feel like GoArch every year releases some new updated translation of all the hymns they use in the churches.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that it seems to me like there's equivalent amounts of effort required in both of those, but we have, I guess, in this country at least, importance placed on one and not the other.
Well, sort of. I mean, a troparia is a lot smaller piece than, right? And
That's true. I'm just
yeah.
thinking. I'm thinking like even like Basil Kazan in our archdiocese, who translated like a whole corpus.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But see, here's the other thing, right? Go and talk to church singers and ask them what they think of Basil Kazan's work.
Yeah, I know.
They all have their little criticisms, and their criticisms aren't compatible, right? One guy wants to change it one way, the other guy wants to change it almost the opposite way, right? And so trying to put together a project to do a new Kazan, right? If they said, we're going to do a new Kazan, we're going to translate the whole corpus again, and we're going to get all these guys together to do it, you'd have similar challenges, I think. So yeah, so that's the thing. And in terms of, I saw your comment there in the chat about just learning Greek. That doesn't work with the Bible. The Bible's not written in Greek. The Greek Old Testament isn't written in Greek. This is a dirty secret that people won't tell you, but the Greek Old Testament is translation Greek, meaning it doesn't follow the rules of Greek grammar. There are lots of places where they're using Greek words, but they're using Hebrew grammar. Like if you've heard someone who knows a little English, who's from a foreign country, they speak English and maybe they don't quite use grammar correctly. Like they're using the right English words, but the grammar's a little weird, right? Like, you go store, right? You know what they mean, right? But it's not correct grammar. That's what reading the Greek Old Testament is like, if you know Greek and not Hebrew. And New Testament Greek, I know they've told you there's this thing, Koine Greek or Koine Greek, if you're Protestant and using Erastian translation. But that's not real. There's nothing written in that Greek except the New Testament, because New Testament Greek relates to Greek sort of the way Yiddish relates to German. It's basically a Jewish dialect of Greek from the 1st century. And so, again, if you don't know Hebrew or Aramaic, you're not going to be able to understand biblical Greek. You have to have at least a little, because people who trust me, I took a classical Greek class at one point where we were reading Xenophon and Herodotus, and as a prank on the last day of class, the professor handed out a page from the Gospel of John, and the other students went crazy because they'd never seen biblical Greek before. They were like, what is this? Is this a joke? This isn't Greek. This doesn't make any sense. This is ridiculous. Because it's not good Greek. Now, if you know, if you are even vaguely familiar, like if you have even just a basic familiarity with Hebrew and Aramaic and you know Greek, then you can read it fine, right? But you have to have some familiarity. Otherwise you end up with like David Bentley Hart's New Testament, where he's trying to turn St. Paul into Plato, you know, like it's like, no, I understand that's what that word means in classical philosophy of the 4th century BC, right? But St. Paul isn't living in the 4th century BC in Athens. He's living in the Levant and the, you know, Palestine in the 1st century AD. Yeah.
I guess as a one final follow-up, then I guess what of the I guess ecumenical patriarchates like Greek Old and New Testament that they've they use and distribute to the churches?
Yeah. So their Greek New Testament is really interesting. The 1904, 1911. The reason it's interesting is that the Greek text there is compiled from 18th and 19th century handwritten lectionaries. By lectionaries, I mean like gospel books from altars and epistle books from parishes in Greece that were handwritten. It's compiled from those. From about 200, they compared 250 handwritten copies and produced that. And then the patriarch at the time made some changes, like he added in that extra verse in 1 John chapter 5, even though it wasn't in any of the texts in any of the actual churches. And so the folks behind compiling it put in a footnote saying that verse was not in any of their copies, but was added because at the behest of and because of the opinion of the patriarch. So it is an interesting thing and a good witness to the text that was being read in 18th and 19th century Greece in Orthodox churches. So it's an important text. And, you know, you could use that, but it's a reproduction handed down of 1st century Greek. It's not modern Greek. That at least as a starting place of what to translate can be an interesting one. It has the imprimatur of an Orthodox patriarch, which says something for it. But the Greek Old Testaments that are in I have one of those around here, the cheap distributed Greek Bibles. The Greek Old Testament in there, I can't tell what text that is. And there's no information about it, meaning like where that particular text comes from. If you buy this, right, Rolf's critical edition, the text of this is from Codex Sinaiticus. And then the footnotes are from all the other manuscripts. Oh, here it is. I do have it right here. This is the Greek Bible. It's the patriarchal New Testament and and some version of the Greek Old Testament. But which version isn't totally clear. And why that one was chosen, and even who chose that one to put in there in that particular copy I have. And there may be other editions that have a different, like a slightly different Greek Old Testament. That's one of the problems with doing an Old Testament that's translated from the Greek is you have to choose which Greek edition to translate. The Orthodox Study Bible, I know they say it's a original translation from the Greek. It's not. It's basically they took the New King James and they took Rolf's, the blue book that I held up, that critical edition, and they sort of corrected the New King James based on Rolf's as each individual translator, because the books were translated by completely different people not working together. Based on their knowledge of Greek, they translate those volunteers corrected the New King James. I don't think the New King James is a good translation. It's part of the problem. But they corrected the New King James, and then basically Father Jack Sparks put it all together and sort of smoothed it out. That's how that Old Testament happened. But if you look at probably the best, if you're just going to read the Greek Old Testament, probably the best one in English is the Lexham English Septuagint. But that's translated from Sweet's critical edition of the Greek. So again, it's an arbitrarily chosen version of the Greek. There's not sort of an official one that was translated, but that was translated by Greek Old Testament scholars. So these are people who know not only 3rd century Alexandrian Greek, but know some Hebrew and Aramaic also. So they can sort of get at when there are Semitic things going on underlying the Greek, to translate it. While we're doing this survey, this one is less good. New English translation of the Septuagint. This was done by mostly Protestant Bible scholars. Is a kind of awful translation just in general. It's not good for devotional reading. If you're an actual scholar, you're not reading it in English anyway. You go and you read the Greek. So I don't know what the point of this book is. I got it cheap. That looks good on the shelf. But yeah. So yeah, that Q&A time went in a different direction, but that's okay. But this is sort of the end of our time proper, unless anybody has any last minute things that they absolutely need to know that can't wait till next month. Hopefully I'll see most of you in a couple of weeks here anyway at the retreat, so you can ask me questions then.
I wanted to thank you, Father, for leading. My daughter had a career high 17 points and led all scorers in the game tonight.
Are they going to make the playoffs? Am I going to have to put up with this forever?
No, she's got 5 more games.
Okay.
It was her best night, though. So thanks for leading tonight and being both the talent and host for the last couple of Bible studies. But we can bring it to an end, I think. I think you've answered all the questions. And now I know why it's so hard to get an Orthodox translation on the Bible.
Yeah, that totally went in a different direction, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. Thanks for being patient with me while I'm in the middle of basketball season with my daughter. Unfortunately, they picked Thursdays for one of their games every week. So Bible studies, I've had to watch the recordings. But thankfully, we're still recording and putting these on YouTube. So I'll try to get this one up as soon as I can. And are we good for the 3rd Thursday in February?
As far as I know,
that would be
yes.
the 20th. Okay,
Yeah.
so February 20th. February 20th will be the next one. And thank you, as always, for being here, Father, and for everyone for attending. Have a good night.
Everybody come to the retreat.
Yes. Hope to see you there.